Okay, let's start. Number 1. Skinwalker Ranch. You're standing in a fenced pasture in the Uinta Basin at dusk, and the cattle on this ranch keep dying the same way, found with organs removed through incisions too clean for any predator, no blood in the grass, no tracks leading in or out. You've read the file. You're still not ready for how quiet it gets out here right as the sun drops behind the mesa. Long before this land had a modern name, the Ute and Navajo people who lived around this stretch of the Uinta Basin marked it as spiritually wrong. Ute oral tradition describes the area as a crossing point for skinwalkers, malevolent shapeshifters capable of taking animal form, and multiple tribal accounts hold that certain families avoid the land entirely to this day, not as folklore recited for tourists, but as a standing personal rule passed down inside families. That reputation existed before ranching, before fences, before any rancher ever filed a report with anyone. Here's where it gets strange. The modern Sherman family, who owned the property through the 1990s, documented and reported years of anomalous activity: mutilated cattle, unexplained lights, structures appearing and vanishing overnight, and encounters they described to investigators in specific, repeated detail. In 1996, real estate and aerospace entrepreneur Robert Bigelow purchased the ranch outright through his National Institute for Discovery Science, and within roughly a decade, the property attracted direct federal interest. Between 2007 and 2012, the Defense Intelligence Agency funded the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program, later folded into the better-known Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, a roughly $22 million classified initiative that multiple journalists and former program officials have since confirmed included direct study of activity at this specific ranch. Personnel connected to the research operated under non-disclosure agreements. Full findings have never been released to the public, and what has surfaced did so only after sustained Freedom of Information Act pressure and congressional questioning years after the funding ended. The Sherman family's own reports, later corroborated by the National Institute for Discovery Science team Bigelow assembled after purchasing the property, described specific, categorized phenomena: large animals vanishing from sealed pastures without a sound, structures that witnesses insist appeared overnight in fields checked clear the previous evening, and electromagnetic equipment failing consistently in specific fixed locations on the ranch, regardless of which instrument was brought in to replace the last one. Luis Elizondo, the former Pentagon official who later went public about directing the classified aerospace threat program, has stated in interviews that Skinwalker Ranch was one location among the broader research effort, without disclosing specifics of what was recovered there, citing ongoing classification. The government did not arrive because of a myth. It arrived because a private buyer's own security team kept filing reports serious enough to reach federal attention, and once it arrived, official comment stopped. Biochemist Colm Kelleher, who worked directly on the National Institute for Discovery Sciences investigation before the Pentagon program began, later co-authored a detailed account of the team's findings, describing repeated instrument malfunctions, tracked but unidentified large animals that left no consistent physical evidence, and a research staff that rotated through the property faster than comparable scientific postings typically would, citing the psychological toll of extended fieldwork there. None of that account carries the weight of a declassified government file. It is, notably, the closest thing to one that has ever become public. What was actually found on the property during those 5 classified years remains unpublished. A 2022 Pentagon report to Congress, part of a broader push for transparency on unidentified aerial phenomena, acknowledged the existence of the earlier classified program without releasing the specific case files tied to the ranch, leaving researchers who filed follow-up records requests waiting years for documents that, when they arrived at all, came back with entire sections redacted. Why would a defense intelligence budget line fund years of study on 480 acres of Utah ranch land unless something documented there met a threshold the public was never shown? A sitting U.S. government intelligence program spent public money studying this exact ground, and the people who lived beside it for generations already had a name for what was wrong with it before anyone in Washington ever heard of Skinwalker Ranch. Number 2. The Chincana Tunnels of Sacsayhuaman. You're standing on the massive stepped ramparts of Sacsayhuaman above Cusco, and your guide has stopped walking. Ahead of you is a collapsed stone passage, half swallowed by rubble, and he tells you plainly that this is as far as any one official goes, not because it isn't safe, because it isn't allowed. The Chincana, whose name translates roughly to the place where you get lost, is a tunnel network documented in colonial-era Spanish accounts as connecting the Sacsayhuaman fortress complex to the Coricancha, the Inca Empire's holiest temple, and possibly extending far beyond it, under the city and the surrounding mountains. Andean cosmology framed the underworld, Uku Pacha, as a real, accessible layer of existence, and certain tunnel entrances were understood within Inca and later local tradition as literal thresholds associated with Amaru, the great earth serpent believed to move between worlds through exactly this kind of stone passage. Here's where it gets strange. According to local accounts and period press coverage repeated by Cusco historians, an expedition entered the tunnel network sometime in the 1920s or 1930s, a priest accompanying a small group of students, by the most common telling, carrying candles and rope to map the passage toward the Coricancha. They did not return on schedule. Some versions of the account say no trace of the group was ever recovered. Other versions say a handful did emerge, days later, from a different opening entirely, unwilling or unable to describe what had happened underground, and never entered a tunnel again for the rest of their lives. Peruvian authorities in the years following sealed multiple known entrances to the Chincana with poured concrete and fitted stone, a closure that has been maintained and, according to conservation reports, reinforced multiple times in the decades since. Spanish colonial chroniclers writing in the decades after the conquest, including accounts drawing on testimony from Inca nobility, referenced extensive underground passageways beneath Cusco linking its most important structures, descriptions detailed enough that 20th century Peruvian historians used them to help identify likely Chincana entrances in the first place. Conservation reports filed with Peru's Ministry of Culture describe at least 2 rounds of additional reinforcement work on the sealed entrances since the original 20th century closures, most recently citing structural risk assessments rather than any new incident, work that has further reduced how much of the original network remains even theoretically accessible. The official reasoning offered for the seals is structural instability and visitor safety, reasonable on its face, given the age and complexity of unsupported Inca-era stonework. It does not explain why the closures specifically targeted entrances tied in local memory to the missing expedition, while leaving other, equally unstable sections of the broader Sacsayhuaman complex open to guided tours. Nor does it explain why no government agency, then or since, has published a complete map of how many entrances to the Chincana originally existed. The Coricancha itself, the temple the Chincana was said to connect to, was once the wealthiest single religious site in the Inca Empire, its walls reportedly sheathed floor-to-ceiling in gold sheeting, before Spanish conquistadors stripped and melted it down within years of their arrival, leaving only the temple's original Inca stonework standing beneath the Spanish colonial church, later built directly on top of it, an architectural layering that echoes the tunnel seals above, conquest followed by construction, followed by silence. Modern requests to conduct ground-penetrating radar surveys across the wider Sacsayhuaman complex, which could settle the tunnel network's true extent without a single stone being moved, have been submitted by outside research teams in past years and have not resulted in a completed, publicly released survey of the Chincana's full path. Nobody official will confirm the true scope of what runs beneath that hillside. They will only confirm how many doors into it are now closed. A tunnel network built to connect the fortress to the empire's holiest temple, understood by the people who built it as a passage to another layer of the world entirely, and sealed by the country that inherited it, using concrete instead of ceremony. Number 3. Rennes-le-Château. You're a parish priest in the 1890s, alone in a crumbling stone church, in a village of barely 200 people in the foothills of the Pyrenees, and you've just pried up a hollow altar pillar during routine renovation. Inside, sealed for centuries, are folded parchments. Beneath the altar floor itself, when you pull up the slab, is something older still, a tomb, Visigothic in style, undisturbed, since long before your church was ever built on top of it. Berenger Saunier reported his discovery to his ecclesiastical superiors and, according to multiple biographical accounts assembled by later researchers, traveled to the bishopric in Paris shortly afterward to deliver what he had found in person rather than by letter. What exactly he handed over, and what exactly church officials told him in return, was never recorded in any surviving public document. Diocesan records from the relevant period show gaps precisely where a full accounting of the exchange should exist. Here's where it gets strange. Within a few years of that meeting, Saunier, a village priest on a fixed and modest clerical income, began funding an extraordinary building campaign. A lavish private villa, an ornamental tower, landscaped grounds, and a heavily redecorated church interior, financed by Wealth, his own housekeeper, and later investigators, could never fully trace to any conventional source. Church superiors eventually opened an internal inquiry into his finances. Saunier was reassigned and later faced ecclesiastical censure. But the underlying question of where the money originated was never publicly resolved either by the diocese or by any French civil authority who looked into it afterward. The building campaign itself became part of the legend on its own terms. Saunier constructed the Villa Bethania, an ornate private residence built on a priest's salary, along with the Tour Magdala, a neo-Gothic tower overlooking the valley that served no clear parish function, and an extensively redecorated church interior featuring unusual religious statuary local guides still point out for its deliberately unsettling iconography, including a demon figure positioned at the entrance holding up the holy water font, an arrangement art historians visiting the site have called almost unheard of in conventional Catholic Church design. The mystery didn't stay contained to Saunier. Several later investigators and treasure hunters who spent years pursuing the source of his wealth and what exactly lay beneath that altar slab died in circumstances local accounts describe as sudden, unexplained, or never fully resolved by police at the time. Long before Saunier ever lifted a floor tile, local tradition already treated the surrounding hills, layered with Visigothic ruins, and later entangled in Cathar history and the brutal 13th century crusade that hunted them through this exact terrain, as uneasy ground, a place with old blood and older secrets already in it. Decades later, the mystery metastasized further when documents surfaced in Paris purporting to trace a secret society called the Priory of Sion back through centuries of European history to guard the very secret Saunier had allegedly uncovered, documents later demonstrated by historians and journalists to have been fabricated in the 20th century by a man named Pierre Plantard, planted in France's National Library specifically to be found. That the foundational conspiracy document was proven fake does not resolve the original mystery, it deepens it. Somebody with real resources and real patience spent years building an elaborate false trail specifically to surround Saunier's actual, still undisclosed discovery, and no one has ever explained why a hoax that elaborate was worth constructing unless there was something underneath it worth obscuring. The painting at the center of the fabricated documents, Nicolas Poussin's Les Bergers d'Arcadie, depicting shepherds gathered around a tomb inscription, hung for generations in the Louvre, long before Plantard ever wove it into his forgery, meaning whoever built the hoax chose a genuine 17th century artwork and retrofitted it into their story, rather than inventing a symbol from nothing, a detail historians studying the affair still find difficult to fully explain as pure coincidence. The Church's own internal file on what Saunier reported that day in Paris has never been made public. The tomb beneath the altar was resealed. The village, small enough that everyone in it knows exactly which floor tile started all of it, still won't discuss what was actually found underneath. Number 4. Mohenjo-Daro's frozen excavation. You're standing on the unexcavated citadel mound at Mohenjo-Daro, and beneath your boots, by every survey estimate available, sits roughly 2/3 of an entire Bronze Age city that no living archaeologist has ever been permitted to touch. The part that has been uncovered is already enough to unsettle you. The part that hasn't is the part nobody will let anyone reach. Indian archaeologist R.D. Banerjee uncovered the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro in 1922, revealing one of the two great anchor cities of the Indus Valley civilization, a Bronze Age culture with planned street grids, covered drainage systems, and standardized brick construction, unmatched anywhere else in the ancient world at that scale. What excavators found scattered through certain quarters of the city disturbed them in ways that outlived the dig itself. Human skeletons lying in open, unburied postures across streets and rooms, as though the residents had simply stopped moving where they stood, along with fragments of fused, glass-like material some 20th century writers controversially read as evidence of instantaneous, extreme heat, a claim mainstream archaeology firmly attributes instead to pottery kiln waste and later fire damage, and disputes to this day. Italian researcher David Davenport revived and popularized the fused glass claim in the 1970s, arguing the vitrified fragments and the scattered, unburied skeletons together pointed toward some form of ancient catastrophic event at the site, a theory mainstream Indus Valley scholars have consistently rejected as inconsistent with the archaeological sequence and the known chronology of the city's decline, which most researchers attribute to river shifts, drought, and gradual abandonment rather than any single violent event. The debate itself, though one-sided among professional archaeologists, has never fully died down, precisely because so much of the city capable of settling it definitively remains formally off-limits to further digging. Here's where it gets strange. In 1965, the Pakistani government, working with UNESCO conservation authorities, imposed a formal moratorium halting all further excavation at the site, officially citing capillary salt action, groundwater seepage rising through the exposed brick and destroying it faster than any team could document it. The reasoning is sound engineering. It is also, 6 decades later, still the operating rule, and it has meant no new excavation has been authorized on the unexposed 2/3 of the site, including whatever lies beneath the Citadel Mound itself, the most likely location for the city's administrative or religious core in more than half a century. The unexcavated Citadel Mound looms over the site precisely because of what the excavated lower city already revealed. A great bath built with waterproof brickwork and a bitumen sealant layer unmatched anywhere else in the Bronze Age world, and a small, enigmatic soapstone statuette, now called the Priest King, found in a structure whose full function was never fully established before excavation stopped nearby. If the lower city held engineering this advanced, and a figure this significant, what the higher, still buried mound holds is, by simple extension, the part of the city its own builders considered most important, and it is also the part nobody has been allowed to touch in over 60 years. Site workers who spent years on the original digs described, in interviews and memoirs collected by later researchers, a persistent unease specific to certain quadrants of the ruins, a bad feeling attached to particular streets regardless of what had or hadn't been found there. Sensations they couldn't tie to heat, dust, or fatigue, and didn't expect anyone to believe. The Indus script found throughout the city remains undeciphered to this day, meaning whatever explanation the city's own people left for what happened here is sitting in plain sight, unread, in a language no one has broken. The moratorium's stated reason is groundwater. Groundwater doesn't explain why the workers who spent the most time in those trenches were the ones least willing to linger after dark. What is actually underneath that Citadel Mound, and is preservation really the only reason 6 decades of governments have left it there, unopened? Once the salt damage explanation get repeated so often, nobody asks what else it might be protecting. Number 5. Denisova Cave. You're a Russian archaeologist in 2008, working through a sediment layer deep inside a limestone cave in the Altai Mountains, and you've just lifted out a single fragment of bone from a child's finger, unremarkable to look at, that is about to force science to add an entire new branch to the human family tree. Genetic sequencing of that fragment revealed a hominin lineage, now called the Denisovans, distinct from both Neanderthals and modern humans, previously unknown to science entirely. But this specific stretch of the Altai Mountains had already drawn organized, secretive outside interest long before that bone was found. Stalin-era Soviet authorities maintained restricted military and research zones across large sections of the Altai region for decades, limiting civilian and foreign access under general security pretexts that were never fully explained even after the Cold War ended. Here's where it gets strange. In the 1930s, the Nazi Ahnenerbe, Heinrich Himmler's Occult Research Institute, dispatched an expedition under zoologist Ernst Schaefer that traveled through Central Asia toward this same general mountain range, and Ahnenerbe internal correspondence, examined by post-war historians, describes leadership's interest in the Altai region, specifically in terms of spiritually significant threshold or gateway ground, language consistent with the Institute's broader search for what it believed were ancient origin sites of civilization. Independently of any of that, local Altai spiritual tradition, unconnected to Soviet or Nazi interest and predating both by centuries, marks the cave region as a liminal place, a threshold avoided for certain rituals and treated with a category of caution distinct from ordinary wilderness. Subsequent excavation seasons revealed something no other known site on Earth has produced. Denisova Cave sediment layers show occupation by Denisovans, Neanderthals, and early modern humans, and in one landmark 2018 finding, the bone fragment of a teenage girl whose mother was Neanderthal and whose father was Denisovan, direct physical proof that these separate human lineages met and interbred inside this specific cave. Three distinct kinds of humanity, overlapping in the same narrow chamber across tens of thousands of years, a convergence found nowhere else yet documented. Following the 2008 discovery, Russian authorities restricted export of key genetic and skeletal material from the site, and access for independent foreign laboratories seeking to conduct their own testing on Denisovan specimens has remained limited for years afterward, a restriction outside researchers describe as unusually tight even by the standards of sensitive paleogenetic material. The stated reasoning centers on preserving fragile, irreplaceable samples and maintaining research priority for the domestic teams who found them, a defensible scientific position that nonetheless keeps outside verification of the full find limited to this day. Dig director Anatoly Derevyanko, who led the decades-long Russian excavation of the cave's stratified layers, has described the site sequence as unlike anything else in the paleoanthropological record, tool assemblages and personal ornaments recovered alongside the remains, showing a level of sophistication some researchers initially assumed could only belong to modern humans, before genetic testing corrected the attribution back to Denisovans, forcing a reassessment of how advanced this separate branch of humanity actually was. Ornamental bracelets and pendants recovered from the same layers, crafted from materials including polished chlorite and marble, are now considered among the oldest known examples of deliberate human personal adornment anywhere on Earth, technology many researchers had assumed belonged exclusively to the modern human lineage until this cave's contents forced the timeline back. Three separate authorities, a century apart from each other, all decided independently that this specific stretch of mountain needed to be controlled. Stalin's government, for reasons of state security, Himmler's occultists, for reasons they described as spiritual, and modern Russia for reasons of scientific priority. The bone itself rewrote the human story. What it was found next to, in ground three different regimes, each felt compelled to seal off in their own way, has never been fully explained by any of them. Number 6. The Sky Caves of Mustang. You're part of a small mountaineer archaeologist team in the early 1990s, granted rare permission to enter the walled former kingdom of Lo, and above you, riddling a sheer cliff face rising hundreds of feet from the valley floor, are thousands of hand-cut chamber openings, a honeycomb of rooms no rope or ladder currently reaches. Your permit took years to obtain. Most of what you're looking at, even now, nobody is allowed to enter at all. The Kingdom of Lo, centered on its walled capital of Lo Monthang, functioned for centuries as a strictly closed buffer state on the Nepal-Tibet frontier, and the Nepalese government maintained that closure formally into the modern era, barring virtually all outside visitors, until finally opening a narrow, tightly licensed trickle of access only in 1992. The cliffside chambers themselves, roughly 10,000 of them by conservative regional surveys, were cut by hand into soft conglomerate rock at heights that still challenge modern climbing equipment, and they hold mummified remains, painted Buddhist murals, and manuscripts, some radiocarbon dated back over 1,000 years, far predating any written record of who built the chambers or fully explains their original purpose. Survey teams that have reached a sample of the accessible chambers using climbing ropes and scaffolding, including expeditions supported by mountaineer Pete Athens in the 1990s, recovered Buddhist manuscripts, painted murals depicting deities and mandalas in styles distinct from anything found in the valley's surface monasteries, and skeletal remains arranged in ways suggesting the chambers served burial, meditation, and defensive functions across different periods of the kingdom's long history, sometimes within the same cliff face. The murals alone, once photographed and studied, have forced revisions to regional art history timelines, showing artistic influences researchers previously assumed hadn't reached this remote a corner of the Himalayas until centuries later. Here's where it gets strange. Local Buddhist tradition holds that specific chambers within the cliffs remain under the watch of protector spirits, guardians who are not to be disturbed, and licensed local guides, operating alongside the government's formal permit system, actively enforce that boundary themselves, steering visiting researchers away from named sections of the cliff face, regardless of what official paperwork a visitor is carrying. The government controls who enters the kingdom. The guides, drawing on belief older than the kingdom's own recorded history, control which caves inside it anyone is actually permitted to see. The kingdom sits inside the dramatic gorge, cut by the Kali Gandaki River, one of the deepest river gorges on Earth, walled on both sides by cliffs, where erosion and hand-carving are sometimes impossible to fully distinguish from a distance, and manuscripts recovered from a handful of surveyed chambers include texts tied to the older, pre-Buddhist Bon religious tradition, alongside later Tibetan Buddhist material, suggesting the caves were used, added to, and reconsecrated across religious eras separated by centuries, each new tradition layering its own meaning onto chambers it did not originally carve. Some of the highest, least accessible chambers show clear evidence of having been used first, with later, lower tiers added across subsequent centuries, implying the original builders deliberately prioritized height and difficulty of access over convenience, a design choice. Archaeologists studying the site read as intentional concealment rather than simple defensive strategy. The overwhelming majority of the roughly 10,000 chambers have never been surveyed by any archaeological team at all, official or otherwise, meaning whatever they still hold, human remains, texts, objects, sits exactly as it was left, sealed behind rock faces too remote and too spiritually guarded for either science or tourism to have reached yet. The Nepalese government finally opened the gate into Lomanthong in 1992, after generations of keeping the kingdom closed to the outside world entirely. The mountain itself, according to the people who have lived beneath it the whole time, never did. Number 7. The Longyu Caves. You're a villager in 1992, standing at the edge of what everyone here has always called the bottomless pond, watching a pump crew drain water that no one in living memory has seen the floor of. The water level drops, and what emerges isn't a floor, it's a ceiling, carved, deliberate, descending into a cavern nobody knew was under the village at all. What the drained pond revealed was one of at least 24 interlinked man-made grottos, cut directly from solid siltstone, some chambers spanning more than 100 feet across with ceilings rising over 100 feet high. Their walls and columns covered in uniform, deliberate chisel mark patterns that required, by conservative engineering estimates, millions of hours of coordinated labor. No historical text mentions them, no regional chronicle, no dynastic record, no temple inscription anywhere in China's famously thorough documentary tradition references who built these caverns, when, or why. A civilization capable of organizing a workforce on this scale left a monument the size of a small underground city and not one sentence of paper explaining it. Here's where it gets strange. Villagers near the site, for generations before the pumping ever happened, avoided fishing that specific pond after dark, describing an unease in the water itself that had nothing to do with depth or current, a wrongness locals attached to the hill long before anyone suspected it was hollow. The hill's older local name carries a warning in its literal translation. One longtime residents interviewed by regional researchers say they were taught to simply repeat, without ever being told why. That avoidance predates the 1992 discovery by generations, according to those same accounts, meaning the caves were already spiritually marked before anyone confirmed they existed. Engineers who studied the exposed chambers after the drainage noted an additional detail that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. Every visible surface, walls, ceilings, and load-bearing columns alike carries the same uniform, parallel chisel stroke pattern, spaced with a consistency that modern quarrying specialists have struggled to replicate by hand at this scale, suggesting either an extraordinarily standardized labor system or a tool and technique that left no other trace in the regional archaeological record. Structural engineers have also noted that despite the cavern's vast open spans, none show any sign of ceiling collapse or structural reinforcement, an engineering restraint some researchers consider as remarkable as the excavation itself. Competing explanations proposed since the 1990s range from an ancient imperial quarry to a flood control reservoir system to an unfinished mausoleum complex, and none fully accounts for the uniformity of the carving, the total absence of tool fragments or worker debris anywhere in or around the chambers, or the total silence of the historical record on a project this size. A 2013 joint survey involving Chinese geological institutes measured the total excavated volume across the accessible caverns at over 300,000 cubic yards of removed stone, a figure that, translated into labor hours by standard ancient quarrying rates, implies a sustained workforce numbering in the thousands over multiple generations, for a purpose still formally listed as undetermined. Regional folklore, collected by ethnographers working the villages nearest the site, describes the hill itself as historically closed, a term elders used interchangeably for both the pond's spiritual reputation and, oddly, for the hill's physical geography, long before anyone had confirmed there was anything to physically close off underneath it. Chinese heritage authorities surveyed and partially opened a handful of the chambers to tourism following the initial 1992 to 1994 investigation, but independent archaeological access to the full site has remained tightly restricted since, with foreign research teams repeatedly denied extended survey permissions and large sections of the identified cave network never opened to any outside study at all. The official position attributes the silence to incomplete excavation and preservation concerns. It does not explain why a project on this scale, requiring generations of planners and workers, produced zero surviving record anywhere in a culture that recorded almost everything else. An entire civilization-scale undertaking, carved by hand into solid rock beneath a pond people already knew not to fish in, sealed once by whoever finished it and walked away without a word, and sealed again by a modern government that decided the rest wasn't worth letting anyone else see. What happened to the workforce that built it? And why did the fear arrive at this hill first, generations before the proof did? Number 8. The Baigong Pipes. You're a geologist scrambling up the rust-colored slope of Mount Baigong above the salt flats of Kaidam Basin, and jutting out of a triangular cave mouth ahead of you are the corroded remains of metal pipes, some running directly into the rock face, others scattered down the slope toward a dry lake bed the locals call, in rough translation, the place with no birds. State media broke the story internationally in 2002, when a Xinhua report described the pipe fragments and the strange, unexplained cave formation drawing scientific teams to one of the most remote corners of Qinghai province. Chinese research teams that examined samples in the years following confirmed the fragments contained unusually elevated iron and silica ratios, inconsistent with typical wrought metal composition, findings consistent, according to official statements, with a natural process of ancient mineral deposition inside fossilized tree roots dating back millions of years. That explanation was offered publicly. The complete geological survey data behind it never was, and independent researchers who later requested extended access to conduct their own testing on the remaining fragments were turned down. Here's where it gets strange. Long before the 2002 media attention, local Mongol and Tibetan herders who grazed livestock near the base of Mount Baigong avoided the lake and the immediate hillside, a documented regional pattern predating any scientific interest in the site by generations. The specific phrasing used by herders interviewed by regional ethnographers describes the ground as a place that does not want you there, tied to older taboo traditions about disturbing the resident spirit of the salt lake below. Livestock, according to multiple herder accounts, resisted being driven near the formation without visible cause, circling wide of the hillside on their own. The cave mouth itself sits roughly 260 feet above the surface of the salt lake, its triangular opening angled in a way local geologists describe as unusual for natural erosion patterns in this specific rock formation, though not conclusively impossible. The 2002 delegation that examined the site included researchers from multiple regional scientific institutes, arriving with sampling equipment and camping gear for what was publicly described as a short preliminary survey. Several members of that team gave interviews afterward, noting the remoteness and difficulty of the terrain, but few offered further public comment once the fuller analysis moved behind institutional doors. Local authorities fenced off the immediate cave area and restricted casual visitor access not long after the international attention peaked, a decision officially framed around erosion control and fragment preservation. The fencing arrived quickly. The full underlying report explaining exactly what those iron-rich fragments are, how old they date to, and why an entire scientific delegation was dispatched to a nearly inaccessible mountain to examine what officials maintain are naturally formed tree root casts, was never released in complete form to the public that funded the expedition. Chinese geologist Bai Yu, whose earlier fieldwork in the region first drew broader scientific attention to the pipe fragments before the 2002 media wave, spent years afterward advocating for continued study of the formation, noting in later interviews that the fossilized root explanation, while plausible for some of the recovered fragments, did not fully account for the specific metallic composition detected in others, a distinction that got flattened into a single tidy explanation once official statements were finalized for public release. Satellite imagery of the immediate area, available through commercial providers in the years since, shows no subsequent survey activity or marked research infrastructure anywhere near the cave mouth, consistent with a site the government would rather leave quiet than continue actively studying in view of anyone watching from above. A government science team went in with cameras and sampling kits and came out with a partial explanation and a fence. The herders who lived beneath that mountain long before any of it needed neither instruments nor a press release to know exactly which slope to keep their animals away from. Number 9. Paracas Necropolis. Your Peruvian archaeologist Julio Tello, in 1928. Standing over a newly opened burial chamber on the wind-scoured Paracas Peninsula, and the mummified remains inside are wrapped in some of the finest, most elaborate woven textiles the ancient Americas ever produced. Then you reach the skulls. Elongated, deliberately, dramatically, well beyond anything ordinary cranial binding practices typically produce, row after row of them, buried with a reverence usually reserved for royalty or priests. Tello's excavation uncovered hundreds of burials at what became known as the Paracas Necropolis, elite interments from a culture that predated the Inca by well over 1,000 years, wrapped in layered textile bundles, so well preserved their dyes and patterns remain vivid today. Later ethnographers working with descendant communities recorded oral fragments describing these particular ancestors in terms that translate roughly to the different-headed ones, spoken of with a mixture of reverence and unease, distinct from how the same communities discussed ordinary burial sites elsewhere on the peninsula. A specific emotional register attached only to this ground. Here's where it gets strange. Peruvian cultural heritage law has long restricted the export of skeletal material from sites like this one, requiring government authorization for any specimen leaving the country for independent testing, a policy justified as protecting national patrimony from exactly the kind of uncontrolled removal that stripped so many other ancient American sites of their most significant finds during the 20th century. But several Paracas skulls that were sent abroad decades ago under earlier, looser arrangements to museums and private research collections in Europe and elsewhere have since gone missing from the institutions that originally received them, with no public accounting of when, how, or under whose authority they left, or where they are now. Tello himself, one of Latin America's first archaeologists of indigenous descent, spent the following decades defending the significance of the find against colleagues who dismissed the Paracas culture as a minor precursor to better-known Andean civilizations, only for later research to confirm the sophistication of Paracas textile technology as among the finest fiber art produced anywhere in the ancient world, dyed in colors that still have not been fully replicated by modern chemists working from the same natural source materials. That same meticulous culture, capable of that level of craft, chose to bind its dead skulls into shapes distinct enough from neighboring groups that some later independent researchers, working outside mainstream peer review, and widely disputed by professional geneticists, have speculatively floated non-standard origin theories for a small subset of the specimens, claims the broader scientific community attributes instead to elite status cranial binding practices well documented elsewhere in the ancient Americas. Independent researchers who have sought fresh genetic testing on remaining specimens still held in Peru describe a slow, heavily gate-kept approval process, one that has left basic questions about the population's biological origin largely unresolved in any peer-reviewed, publicly accessible form decades after Tello's original dig. The stated justification is heritage protection, a legitimate concern anywhere in the world for artifacts this significant. It does not explain why so many of the specimens that did leave the country under official sanction simply stopped appearing in any institutional inventory at all. Institutions known to have received Paracas specimens decades ago, including at least one European museum collection, have confirmed in response to later inquiries that they can no longer locate certain skulls within their own holdings. With accession records ending abruptly and no deaccession or transfer paperwork explaining the gap, a pattern researchers attempting to compile a complete modern census of surviving Paracas skulls have run into repeatedly across multiple countries. Peru's own national museum dedicated to the culture, built specifically to house and protect what remains in the country, restricts direct physical examination of its most significant specimens to a short list of pre-approved institutional researchers, a policy staff describe as necessary after past incidents of damage and unauthorized sampling by visiting academics decades earlier. The questions were never really about the shape of the skulls. They were about why an entire category of ancestor, marked out by the people who buried them as different in some way worth remembering, keeps disappearing from the paper trail the instant it crosses a national border. Number 10. The Vatican Necropolis. You're a laborer in 1940, working by lamplight in a narrow excavation shaft beneath the floor of St. Peter's Basilica, and you've been told, in terms that left no room for negotiation, that nobody outside this project is to know what you're doing down here. Above you, the largest church on earth continues its daily masses, entirely unaware that the ground beneath the high altar is being quietly, systematically dug open on the direct personal order of the Pope. Pope Pius XII authorized the excavation in 1940 in secrecy, seeking physical confirmation of the tradition that the Apostle Peter was buried at this exact spot beneath the basilica that bears his name. The work continued in full concealment throughout the remainder of World War II, and for years afterward, unknown to the public, unknown to most of the clergy working directly above the dig, classified by a government that happens to also be a church and a sovereign state all at once. The Vatican did not merely restrict access after the discovery. It restricted knowledge of the excavation's very existence from the moment it began. Here's where it gets strange. What the diggers found beneath the basilica was not a single tomb, but an entire buried street of the dead. A Roman-era necropolis stretching back to before Christianity was legal in the empire, pagan mausoleums standing directly alongside early Christian burial niches, the two faiths dead sharing the same buried avenue in a way no surviving text had prepared anyone for. Deep inside it, near what tradition marked as Peter's grave, excavators uncovered a wall covered in ancient graffiti invoking Peter by name, and, in a sealed compartment within that wall, a collection of human bones. The Vatican did not announce any of this to the world until 1950, a full decade after the digging began. Even then, the specific claim that the recovered bones were Peter's own was not publicly confirmed until 1968, 28 years after the first shovel went into that floor, and outside scholars have disputed the identification ever since, pointing to inconsistencies in how and where within the site the bones were actually recovered. Margherita Guarducci, the epigrapher who spent years after the initial dig studying the graffiti wall and the bone fragments recovered from within it, became convinced the remains matched Peter specifically, based on their location within a marble-lined compartment set apart from the rest of the necropolis's burials, wrapped in a fabric later analysis dated to the correct historical period, and dyed in a shade of purple traditionally associated with honor reserved for the highest status. Other archaeologists who worked the same excavation disputed her sequence of events and her handling of the bones, a professional disagreement that has never been fully settled and that the Vatican, as the sole authority controlling further access to the physical evidence, has never allowed outside independent testing to resolve. Access to the necropolis today remains tightly restricted. Visits require booking the Scavi tour months in advance, admit only small guided groups, and explicitly forbid photography and phones throughout, a level of control unusual even by the Vatican's own standards for the rest of the basilica above it. Visitors who have taken the tour consistently describe the same reaction once the guide leads the group past the pagan tombs toward the graffiti wall, a stillness that has nothing to do with temperature, a sense, hard to name, of standing somewhere that predates the religion built directly on top of it. Pope Paul VI made the identification public in 1968 in a formal address, choosing his words with the same institutional caution the Vatican had applied to every stage of the project, confirming the relics as authentic, while declining to detail the full chain of forensic reasoning behind that conclusion to the general public, leaving the underlying dispute among the scholars who actually excavated the site unresolved, even as the announcement closed the question officially. 10 locations. 10 separate authorities: tribal, communist, colonial, ecclesiastical, and now the oldest continuous religious government on earth, each deciding independently, the moment they found something, that the correct next step was to control exactly who was allowed to know. A Utah ranch, a Chinese hillside, a Pakistani mound, a Peruvian tunnel, a French village floor, a Siberian cave, a Nepalese cliff, and now the floor beneath the largest church ever built. Different centuries, different governments, the same reflex every time. Find it, then seal it, then decide, quietly, who gets to be told. If any of these 10 got to you, subscribe for more. Tell us in the comments which sealed location you'd want opened first, and let us know where in the world you're watching from.